Welcome to Newswatch, your chance to tell the BBC exactly what you think of the news. Coming up later, an inside look at how BBC News covers upsetting stories like the earthquake in Haiti on programmes aimed at children and families. But first, it probably hasn't escaped your attention that there's been a bout of rather cold weather recently. The so-called Big Freeze sent an army of BBC reporters rushing for their puffer jackets, and their reports dominated the airwaves recently. The icy conditions delivered red-hot ratings. A BBC One special programme got 6 million viewers, and indeed local news bulletins also enjoyed record audiences. But for some of you, the blanket coverage of the story received a very frosty reception. Helen Shepherd here speaks for many of you.
Well, I thought the coverage was completely over the top. I can understand the severity of the weather and the fact that many people turned to the BBC for information made it newsworthy. But what the BBC gave us was a solid week of people telling us that it was cold, that it was snowing and that we were running out of grit. And for me, that was just regurgitating the same news over and over again. To be honest, it got very boring.
Well, James Stevenson is the editor of the BBC's 6 and 10 o'clock news. Welcome. What do you make of that accusation that, look, we got the point fairly early on in this story that it was cold and snowing and that BBC News just overkilled the story? Yeah.
Well, I understand, obviously, the point that Helen Shepherd is making, and I think we did all grasp early that it was very bad weather, and I think that doesn't mean it's not interesting to our audience and something we want to show how it's playing out across the country, not least because for practical reasons, which is people wanted to know, needed to know. There's a public service dimension to seeing where the weather is going to worst affect places, right, and what the impact is. Beyond that, I think our coverage wasn't, I think it's a little unfair to say it stopped at it's snowing and there's not enough grit, because we looked at the various really quite substantial implications of this kind of weather on people's normal lives.
But I don't think that was her whole point, indeed not the point of many people who wrote in, that it wasn't that the BBC didn't do enough of it, it's that you did too much of it, and after a while it really wasn't that illuminating.
Oh, well, what I was trying to get at was we looked at the impact of school closures on people's ability to go to work. We looked at whether or not it was having a broader effect on the economy. We looked at what I think many people were talking about, which is if we're hearing so much about climate change, how come this weather is so bad?
Let's have a look at one particular programme. On Wednesday last week, you did half the programme on the 6 o'clock news on the snow. In fact, you didn't get to the second story, which was the leadership challenge to the Prime Minister, a major political story. You didn't get to that for 12 minutes. Now, looking back on that, with the benefit of hindsight, perhaps do you now believe that you got overly excited by this story and you wouldn't have done it the same if you had a second chance?
In honesty, I don't think that. I mean, 12 minutes isn't half of the 6 o'clock news, and so getting to a second story when it's a big story of that importance, with that many, as I say, different dimensions to it, I think that's a reasonable thing to do. In picking up the sort of other half of your question about the leadership challenge, I mean, that was 2 former cabinet ministers laying down a challenge, and that was an important story, and we did cover it. Our feeling, our judgment was on where that story was playing out to relative to the importance and the impact of the weather. We felt we were in the right place.
James Stevenson, many thanks. Well, the tragic earthquake in Port-au-Prince in Haiti quickly blew the snowy weather off the top of the news bulletins. Almost immediately, pictures of the dead and wounded found their way into the BBC, some of which, of course, were broadcast. And news programmes are the only place where you will find such pictures before the watershed. They can shock people into action, obviously, and powerfully give the reality of the impact of such a disaster. But how sensitive should news editors be when choosing to put such pictures out during family viewing hours? At lunchtime on Wednesday, the 1 o'clock news ran their piece about the earthquake without warning viewers they would see disturbing images, even though the same piece on the BBC website did carry such a warning. Well, disturbing material before the watershed is a subject you've been contacting us about for some time. Here's Jo Windeler, a mum of 2 from North Wales.
I think parents need to know when it is safe to allow their children to watch the news and to gain the benefits of understanding that the news undoubtedly gives them. So for me, it would be perhaps not putting too much information on programmes like Breakfast, which is really aimed at a family market, and perhaps not going into too much detail in news items that are on before the watershed.
And Ken Percy writes, I am increasingly concerned that the BBC needs to show pictures of a harrowing nature to keep up with other sensationalist journalism seen elsewhere. Well, in a moment I'll be putting those particular points to James Stevenson, but first an inside look at how one programme used to reporting difficult stories, indeed for all ages, Newsround, decided how to cover the earthquake.
This is Newsround. Their worst earthquake in hundreds of years destroys much of the Caribbean island of Haiti.
So tonight's programme is different to most of our programmes because we're having just one main top story. We feel that the earthquake is a strong enough story to justify making that the only story that we handle tonight. The first issue is obviously feeds coming in to us in the office have got some upsetting images which we would never be able to broadcast. We have to be conscious that our age range from 6 to 12 is quite a delicate one in terms of dealing with foreign issues, because a large part of what we have to do is put it in context for them and make them aware that this is something that was unlikely to happen to them, but also make them feel compassion for what's been going on in other countries.
It lasted a minute and was then followed by two other strong aftershocks. Homes, businesses, hotels and a hospital came crashing down. The presidential palace collapsed and the United Nations headquarters there was also completely destroyed.
We have a blanket ban on dead bodies. We don't want to show dead bodies. So today's earthquake story, I think that was the first thing, the first conversation we had when I rang up this morning with the team this morning was just, everybody knows it, but you can never check too many times. And I was pleased to say that everyone was on board with that.
Now, we've seen lots of really upsetting pictures coming out of Haiti. What is the country like?
Because we have presenters that are well known to our audience, having somebody in studio is a way of doing that. Having a more conversational style, especially if we're discussing difficult things like families and children who've lost their lives or lost loved ones, that's a key way for us to handle it. The pictures in themselves, although we would make severe judgments whether they were upsetting or not, I think a lot of it is also how we tell the story outside of the pictures.
6-year-olds are still 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds are still, they love animal stories, they love funny stuff, and they can take on board and understand things like what's happened today in Haiti, but it's hard for them, and they'll probably, even though they've got all the information from us, hopefully, they'll still have conversation with their mums and dads and teachers just to sort of get their heads around exactly what it is, and we hope they'll go to the Newsround website to get a bit of a better understanding.
Newsround. See you later, guys. Bye.
Randy.
3, 2, 1, 0.
Well, James Stevenson is the editor of the 6 and 10 o'clock news and still with us. What are your views about how you should manage news either side of the watershed? Do you take that strongly into account?
Very much so, yeah. I mean, it's a very difficult area for us to deal with because, as you say, it's the only area of output which shows that kind of material before the watershed, and the idea of the watershed is there for a good reason. It's there to protect young people from inappropriate material. Having said that, I think that there's a widespread recognition in the BBC, amongst the organisations that regulate the BBC, and most importantly amongst the audience, that the news has a place at that time of day. People know what it is, they know where it is, and so part of it is we have an expectation, I think we share an expectation with the audience that we will be able to do these difficult and upsetting subjects, but we also need to think carefully about how we do them.
But you say people know what it is. I'm not sure that's true. I mean, what is it that you will broadcast at 10 o'clock that you didn't cover on the 6 o'clock?
Well, to give you the specific example of the Haitian disaster and the terrible tragedy that's unfolding there, at 10 o'clock we showed dead bodies on air. At 6 o'clock we didn't do that, and we think it's inappropriate to do that at 6 o'clock. So what we're trying to balance, and it's a very difficult balance, I accept, is to look at conveying the magnitude of the story while not gratuitously upsetting our audience.
Is there a rule which says no dead bodies on the 6 o'clock news? If you're sitting watching with your family, you know that won't be shown.
I have that rule with my team, so yes, and it's not just...
So that's a commitment that you can make to the audiences. You can watch the 6 o'clock news, you won't see dead bodies.
Well, you'll find with all of these things, it's best never to say never, because a situation will arise in which we might feel that in exceptional circumstances there's a reason and a justification for doing that. But just to give you an idea of the thought processes that are going on in the newsroom, and it's not just the output editors, but it's the producers, the reporters, the output editors, me as the editor of the programme, and people higher in the organisation, people involved in looking at our editorial values, we're all thinking carefully about where do we put the line between conveying the full enormity of a story and not, as I say, unnecessarily upsetting the audience.
James Stevenson, many thanks. Well, finally, back to the coverage of the snow.
A lot of people had to abandon their cars overnight and try and find a hotel if they were lucky.
Danielle Glavin's reports from snowy Hampshire prompted some of the more caring of you out there to contact us. Askari Kazmi, watching online in Pakistan, wrote, This is awful. Why do you treat your employees like that? Please treat them like human beings. Well, I've got to tell you, we checked up on Danielle to see how she was holding up and asked for pictorial proof that she was in fact okay, and I am very pleased to report that we received this picture of a very nice, warm and toasty Danielle with a nice mug of tea sitting by the radiator. Well, thanks for all your comments this week. If you want to share your opinions on BBC News and current affairs, you can call us on